Good morning. I hope you can all see me. I'm very excited to be part of this remote conference. It's my first remote conference. Oh, that was not planned, sorry. So you might be wondering why I'm talking to you about our skeptics, to you who are coming together on a Saturday morning in front of your PCs despite the coronavirus. So you are probably not the ones who are skeptic, need to be convinced, but there's many people out there who've not really used R and who could use R, but for some reason they don't, and I think they should. And most of these people use SPSS, or many of them, and I'm going to call them the applied researchers or the social researchers, just because this is the group I'm most familiar with. I'm actually also part of this group. And I would like to talk to you about why they are currently using SPSS, in my opinion, why they should use R, and how we could make them use R. So first, to my background, because I myself started using SPSS and then turned into a real R lover. So first, I studied psychology, and I also did my PhD in psychology, even though it was a statistics topic. So here I started out using SPSS. And I also got to know R a little bit in this phase. During my PhD, I also studied statistics. I did my master in statistics in 2016. And afterwards, I worked as a postdoc at the University of Zurich, where I mainly worked with statisticians. Well, they at least had all the background in statistics. So this is me as a social scientist and me as a statistician. And for 1 month now, I am working in 2 different jobs, where in one job, I'm only working with statisticians at the Healthcare Science Institute of the University of Lucerne. My colleague actually is using Python, but he knows R as well. And at the Pädagogische Hochschule Lucerne, I'm working with people who, most of them, or basically all of them, use SPSS. And at the same time, I'm president of the Swiss Statistical Society, where I see myself as a person who has to talk about what statistics is, what statisticians do, what they need. So I see myself in a role as an ambassador who has to talk about statistics to other people and to communicate between different fields. For all of you who don't know SPSS, this is what it looks like. So it's really straightforward. It has a graphical interface. I won't show you the data view, which is on the top left here. It's a normal view of data as we all know it, but you also have the option of a variable view. And here you can see that you can not only label the variables. So for example, if you take a look, can you see my cursor? I guess not, but in the second line, you have the C variable, which is called C, and in R it would just be C. And then you have the label column, in which I can just write down what I meant by C. So in case I forgot, here it says teacher quality. So what I'm measuring with this variable is teacher quality. And I can always switch back to the variable view is SPSS and just check out what I meant by my variable. And then I also have the value labels. So for example, for LP sex, which is the third line, it's my third variable, I can say that by 0 I meant männlich, which is male, and then of course 1 would be female. So this is very easy to use and also very important sometimes, especially when you use survey data, because then you might have a variable like, for example, profession of a person, and you just have numbers in there, and of course you need to know which number stands for which profession. And in those cases, it's very useful to have value labels. Also, a very important characteristic of SPSS is that you have this characterization of all the methods you can use. So when you go and analyze, you get this drop-down menu, and here all the available methods are sorted in some way, which might be weird to some of us, the way of sorting them, but it's the way that social scientists usually use their methods. So for example, we have the compare means part, which would be the sixth from the top. And this is the analysis of variance. And then we also have the general linear model, the generalized linear model, and regression, which to statisticians would all be the same thing, basically. But since this is how they learned their methods, for them it's easier to understand it that way. And then you also have this feature I just learned about actually, which is under regression, the automatic linear modeling. And here you can put in all your variables under predictors and one target variable under target. And what you do is basically something like a machine learning algorithm that looks for the most important variables, the most important predictors to predict the target. And it also estimates you a regression model for those variables. So this is basically what we all learned we should never do, because there's not a training and a test data set. You just have this one data set. And you estimate a regression model on it, and afterwards you get all the estimates. And you pretend that you have set up that model beforehand. So SPSS appears to be the jack of all trades. It does whatever you want, and you don't really have to understand what you're doing. It just gives you a result for all your analysis. So the simple advantages basically are the graphical interface. The methods are structured in a straightforward way, and also the results are structured in a very straightforward, understandable way. And it almost always gives you a result and not an error. So these are the advantages, but SPSS is rather expensive, which is one reason why many companies and also universities would like to stop using it and use other programs. It's very intransparent, so you don't really know what algorithms are used, how the parameters are estimated, which is also why it's not reproducible. So sometimes you don't really know how to estimate the same model with a different program. And it's focused on getting the results. You don't really have to understand the method behind. Sometimes you don't really have to know what method you're using. And this is what I think something that could promote bad scientific practices. So I don't know if you heard of the reproducibility crisis in social sciences, which is based on bad scientific practices. And I think that this is why people should stop using SPSS, or at least try to use R instead. And this is also why I think my teachers already, when I was studying psychology, started to use R, which was 2009, 2010, when I was a tutor for statistics for psychology students. And within one of these courses, we started using R. Back then, it was really just base R mainly, where we tried to reproduce the same things we did with SPSS before. So we did analysis of variance, we did t-tests, and we were sitting in front of this very basic R, where we just had this blinking cursor, and it was kind of frustrating to most of us, and many of us quit R using shortly afterwards. So for example, when you just type in general linear model, it won't help much. You really have to understand what you're doing. You really have to know how R works in order to be able to use it. Then, as I told you, I started to study statistics during my PhD. And this is where I really got to know a different version of R. And I really discovered the endless potential of R, which lies not in reproducing the same methods as we use in SPSS. It's more that you have the opportunity to really understand what you're doing, to simulate your own data, to understand how your data works, how your methods work. You have Shiny apps in which you can understand those methods. You can write your own functions and even packages if there's anything you don't have available in R. You can see the source code of all the functions you have available. You can even contact the developers, and you have crazy stuff like text mining or analysis of geographical data, and everyone can use them. It's not that it's only restricted to certain groups of people. So for me, the main advantage of R would be first that exactly this is not possible. So when you type in general linear model, it gives you an error. R does not know what you mean. So you really have to know which method you're using, how you're using it, what your estimator is, and all these things in order to be able to really estimate the model. And then you might get your first error message, and then you really start to understand your data and your method. Another big advantage for me is that it's open source. So whenever I don't really understand what my function is doing, I can just type in the name of the function and I get a description of what exactly it's doing. Here I have the example of the ICC, which is a coefficient that is used quite often in social sciences. And there's very many different ways of computing it. And every program does it differently. So here I just typed in two versions that are implemented in the multi-level package. And you can see it's just a couple of lines of code, and afterwards you know exactly how the ICC is computed in this case. Also important is the open code, open data part. Here's one example, the OSF Home that promotes open science, where you can really easily access available master scripts, for example, for publishing your code and your data. Then we also have the Shiny apps, and I think we're going to hear about that a lot today, so I don't really have to go into detail here. I just have 4 examples on this slide, but there's many more out there that really help a lot to understand the statistics behind what we're doing. So this is what I think why really many people, or most of people, should use R for their research. But how can we make them use it, or how can we make it more easily accessible to them? So first of all, I've been teaching R for a long time now. I started out in 2009, as I told you, and I think things got much better in time. But what I think is most important is that you really start teaching R and not SPSS. So we did that at the University in Zurich in the end, and I think when people started using SPSS, they expect a graphical interface and they expect the program they know. But when they start with R, it's easier for them. They don't have to switch, and they don't find R as frustrating as they do when they learned SPSS before. And then I think for all the teachers who teach statistical methods, it's important to use R throughout the whole time. So for every method you are teaching, show the R examples, show easy examples and plots, which make it much easier to understand. And something that we did a little too much in the beginning was the introduction of R. So the vectors, objects, mode, and so on. This stuff can be really frustrating in the beginning when you don't really need them yet. So I think you should explain to people what it is, but explain these things more in detail as soon as they really need them. And what I also found out is that you have to practice a lot. So for me, who learned 4 languages already, I would say R is just another language, and languages need to be practiced. So whenever there's a tiny analysis or anything, just type it in R and try to use it with R and make your students use R as much as they can. And the really difficult stuff for them is things like loops and functions, and I would say they don't really need to use them. There's many packages that they can use that are very easy to use, and loops and functions might be necessary later on, but not in the beginning. And then I think it's also important that what I do right now is that I only teach introductory courses in the beginning, which might be 1 or 2 days. And afterwards, I really try to focus on one topic that people need and not more general R courses. Because everything you don't need right away, you will forget. That's my experience. So what can help you to teach people R? There's a lot of available packages that haven't been out there when I started using R. And well, most of them at least, and that make it much easier to understand it. So for example, for transferring from SPSS, back then we only had the foreign package. Now there's also Haven, XPSS, and a lot of packages to help get along with these label values. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Then there's a lot for teaching R. I just gave you 2 examples with Swirl, which helps you to learn R, and the graphical packages. I think it's very important to use them as well, just to make things easier understandable and more graphical, which is always easier to learn. And for specifically analyzing social science data, there's also a lot of packages out there that make it easier than just using base R. So I just named a couple of them. I'm not going too much into detail with all of them. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So, for example, back then we only had the foreign package to load SPSS data. Now there's also Haven. I'm just going to show you quickly what the main differences are. So, in both cases, I of course already loaded both packages. I don't have that code in here. And the read SAV function is for Haven, and the read SPSS is for foreign. So I'm loading the same data set with both of these functions. Important for the foreign package for the read SPSS is that you also type into data frame equals true. Otherwise, you will get a list, which makes it a little annoying, I think. So this is something you have to know. Then what you see when you take a look at the structure of the variables, you have those variables that didn't have the value labels, the ones that I showed you before in SPSS. And this IVKL is one example. So this variable didn't have a label, a value label. The basis form, the other variable I'm showing, had that value label. And what the 2 packages do is that Haven transfer the one without the label into numeric variable, and foreign does the same thing. The only difference is that Haven also gives it some attributes additionally. The important thing is when we have value labels like the basis form, in Haven we get a Haven labeled class, which is a new class that has some specific characteristics. So for example, it's still a numeric variable, but it has these so-called labels that you can see down there under attributes, and all these labels have names. And the names of the labels are the same things as what you saw in SPSS before. What foreign does is just to make it into a factor, which is base R. So what we have is a numerical factor. Well, not numerical, but yeah, we have the numbers and we have the levels. So consequently, when you want to see a table of a foreign variable, a foreign factor variable, you just get what we know, the usual table. The thing is, this doesn't really work anymore with Haven labels because it doesn't use the labels for the table. So we just get the numbers and the frequency. And this is why we have this other package XPSS, which you can see in the top of the slide. And here you have a function CRO, which stands for cross table. And this you can use for the Haven label, and it gives you a really nice plot of the table of your variable. Another really useful package for social scientists is the psych package. It has a lot of different methods that are useful. I'm just going to show you some really simple functions like the describe function that gives you all the important descriptions of a variable that are, well, in general important, but might be specifically important to social scientists. Well, like the mean, standard deviation, median, and so on. And then we have this function, I'm also not going into detail a lot, which is called alpha. It's the Kronbach's alpha. It is very important for analyzing survey data. And this is very useful because you get all the description of a variable that comes from surveys. So what we have here is a data set in which these variables that I typed in are measuring the same thing, measuring a latent variable. And in this case, it's useful in a first step to calculate alpha. And this is what you see here with all the descriptions of the single variables. Then another very useful package is the HMISC. For example, you can get a nice description of the correlations of the variables that are that you used. And yeah, this is basically all I'm going to say about packages you can use. I've named a lot more in the slide before, but I'm not going to show you all of them. It was just to help you know that there is a lot out there, and then you could just Google them and use them for your teaching. So this was the part for those of you who teach R to skeptics. But I think many of you are also developers, and I think that it's also important to know for developers what they can do to help skeptics or people who are not very familiar with R to use it. I've come to hear a lot that people ask questions on the internet, ask questions on Stack Overflow, for example, and they got really harsh comments. And I think this is one thing that really is important, that the tone on the internet towards people who are not really familiar with R, who don't really know the language that R users are using, is more friendly and more welcoming and more inclusive, which fits very well into this conference today, I think. Also something, I mean, I know that R is free and you do that in your free time, basically. But some documentations and help functions are really difficult to understand for those who are not in mathematics. So I think this would also help to maybe get some nicer descriptions of what the functions are doing. So my conclusion is, I think SPSS is very convenient in the beginning and people find it very appealing, but it may enhance bad scientific practices. And I think this is one reason why people really should try to use R. Even though R is really inconvenient at the beginning and it scares away a lot of people, but I think it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that R can be made attractive to many people. And there's many tools out there that can help make it attractive to people and that can help teach it to people. And I think that also developers can contribute to that and can help making R more accessible to everyone. So thank you very much for your attention. And after this rather light talk, I'm going to give over to all the specialists who are going to talk about.
Yeah, so thank you, Stella, for your talk. Can you see the Q&A at the bottom of your screen? So because there is one question. Yes. There is one question right now, so maybe. No, you don't see it. So maybe I will ask it. So one question is did you had problem with journals saying that you should use SPSS because R comes with no warranty? So it's a problem of the certification of R as a software statistics.
Well, I myself didn't have that problem, but I heard about it, yes. So, but that was a couple of years ago. So I don't know the person who asked that question if he or she had that problem recently, because I have the impression that R gets more and more popular or known in the community. Yeah. So that people don't say that anymore, but I'm not sure about that. And of course, that is an issue, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe, yes, I think also that R is getting more and more popular. And yes, we have more questions in the chat, so maybe, so to message to the attendee, please use the Q&A panel on the bottom of the screen to ask questions. So, so yes, so one question is so that your teaching introduction is for non-computer science students. So do you think it's easier for Python or Java students to switch to R as well? If you have that experience in your teaching,
I think so, yes. I also learned Python myself and it's very similar actually.
Yeah, because I think when you have a programming background, more or less, it's more easy to switch to R. Yeah. And how many people did you manage to convert so far to R?
I can't really count them because I also did introductory courses for beginners, and they hopefully are all using R now because they don't know SPSS. I didn't teach it to them.
Yeah.
This would be a couple of hundred then, and I hope they're still using it. Yes.
Yeah, and so I also have some question for you, because I am also teaching R to non-statistician or non-programming people. Do you think, so what do you think of this question of maybe you should no more teach base R, but maybe switch in the beginning to tidyverse because it's more user-friendly or beginner-friendly in a way, or more efficient for data management? Do you have experience with that?
I don't do it because I think that it's a bit like a different language, and I think they have to know base R. They have to know the basic functions as well, just because they have to understand all the other packages that are out there. So I teach tidyverse only in special courses, but not for beginners.
Okay, and but do you also promote the use of RStudio as an IDE?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, that's something I didn't write down. It's also, of course, I do that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it really helps to introduce R.
Yeah. And there's actually also many tools inside RStudio that make it much easier.
Yeah.
To get along with many things. Yeah.
And so we have another question. So what's the best way to promote an open culture of learning R? Does each member have a responsibility to encourage this?
Sorry, again?
Yes. What's the best way to promote an open culture of learning R?
An open culture. Yeah, I think that's basically what I just said. Maybe I don't understand the question, but it's also what I understand as part of the culture is how people talk to each other and how inclusive the environment is. And I think that's really something that's important.
Yeah.
I was also working for the Forwards Task Force a couple of years ago. I don't know if you heard of that. And they made a survey at their conference because there's been cases of women who just didn't feel respected at the conferences by the way they were talked to. So I think this is really something important that that's an inclusive environment where even people from whatever different backgrounds feel welcome.
Yeah, I think this is really true. We have to take care of beginners or non-programmers in this back. Yeah. And so somebody, so some people that ask a question say, which conference was it that you mentioned just now?
Which conference?
You mentioned a conference where there was this inclusive behavior. So which one was it?
The R conference in San Francisco in 2005.
Okay. Yes, and maybe one last question from my side. Are your colleagues very supportive with your vision of providing R to beginners instead of SPSS?
Yeah, well, that depends on the colleagues, but it's really getting better. So a couple of years ago, many, especially professors, actually were very skeptic because they didn't use it themselves. Yeah. And that's also actually a huge problem because how should they supervise doctoral students that use R when they don't themselves? Yeah. But since it's getting more and more spread out within the community, it's really getting less. So I don't hear that very often anymore. I mean, people are more afraid than really skeptic, in most cases.
Okay, so thank you, Stella. And I think we will skip to the next speaker, which is Benjamin. So